Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 10th chapter in the first book of Kings. We're going to cover verses 14 through 29 all the way home till the end. But what I want you to do is turn to the fourth chapter of the same book because that sets the foundation of the review we're going to establish. You should see the title of these YouTube videos and have your Bible turn to that page before you get here. It's not about, you shouldn't be watching me. You should be looking at your Bible when you do these things. And if you notice me, I'm frequently looking down. I do these things extemporaneously. I'm not looking at any notes. I'm just really analyzing the text. But in the fourth chapter, now there are two relevant verses, the first of which is the 30th. Therein we learn that Solomon, the pinnacle figure in the Hebrew wisdom tradition, his wisdom surpassed and excelled, went above and beyond any rival. He was without equal in the East and in the wisest man who ever lived, Jesus Christ accepted. And then in the 34th verse, we read that there came from all people, from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom, to hear the wisdom of Solomon. In the review we're going to cover, we meet a queen who came from a distant land, and it's given more detailed description to the general picture that is spoken of in the 34th verse we just read. And this queen is from Sheba. Now, Sheba had nomadic origins. These were the people who pilfered some of Job's agricultural items in the first book. They were nomads in the patriarchal era when Job was written. By the time Israel had reached her golden age, Sheba had ceased being, the Sabaeans had ceased being a nomadic people and became a settled kingdom and a force to be reckoned with. And Solomon's fame went above and beyond, and she lived 1,000 miles away. And this was some distance by this traveling standards of the day, but she came because she heard the rumor of this great king, of his wealth and his wisdom, and she leaves thoroughly impressed. And the queen of Sheba heard the report of Solomon concerning the name of Yahweh and came to try him with hard questions. So she's enticed and allured by the reputation of the wisdom that he has. She wants to test it and see if he is really as wise as they say he is. She hears great things, and she also hears the name of Yahweh connected to him. So during Solomon's reign, we witness a rare example of Israel filling their evangelical mandate to be a blessing to the nations of the earth. Solomon did that. He left this woman with the testimony of Yahweh, the God of Israel. And she came to Jerusalem with a very great company. Second verse, she had all these things, all these items of wealth. And then she came to Solomon and she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. She held nothing back. She observed no restraint in the questions she asked. She was there deliberately to test him with the most difficult questions conceivable or imaginable. Nevertheless, he has the answer to all her questions. And Solomon answered all her questions. There was no matter hidden from the king that he did not make known to her. This is a rare species of wisdom, certainly exceptional for a woman who would have been wise enough to seek out the source of wisdom and to have her wisdom enhanced, to have no question too difficult that he could not answer. He had an encyclopedic knowledge, which we can read in the fourth chapter. He was a scientist as well as a philosopher, as well as a theologian, as well as the king on top of it all. So he is the combination of church and state, the king and the preacher of Ecclesiastes. But to return to the text itself, we're gonna she sees for herself. She has a witness, visible testimony of the house that he lived in, the palace in which he dwelled, and all the food and all the servants and all of the extravagance of his court life, of which we're going to read of in greater detail in the section we're going to actually cover when we get there. And she observes sacrifices of Yahweh. Once more, Israel is giving a witness to the nations at this rare moment in time in her history. And she tells the king flat out that the rumors were only at best half true. She found out for herself, and the fact that she traveled some 1,000 miles to do so was cause enough for the Savior to chide the evil and adulterous sign seekers from the evil and adulterous generation in which he lived. He chides them for failing to recognize the Messiah in their midst when this queen traveled some 1,000 miles and a greater than Solomon was here. But I did not believe the words until I came and saw with my own eyes. And see, I have not been told the half. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the report which I heard. Blessed are your men, and blessed are these your servants, who stand continually before you, who are hearing your wisdom. Seeing is believing. So she saw for herself. She had to find out. She doubted, or she wanted to see. She was curious to determine the truth. So her faith was not a blind one. She actually saw what she believed, saw with her own eyes. This is a direct, tangible witness, something better than the telephone game of secondhand reports. At some point, the rumors would have been distorted from the truth, especially in a traveling distance of 1,000 miles. But his wealth and wisdom, which were closely connected, Solomon's wealth enabled him to amass a substantial fortune. We're talking about the modern equivalent of a trillionaire. We'll get to that more when we get to that. But, the extravagance of his palace and his courts is such that she actually envies the servants who have the intimate. She would seemingly rather be a servant in his palace than a queen in her own. She envies the servant because of their intimate proximity to such wisdom. Just to have this wealth of wisdom, this fountain, this wellspring of profound wisdom at their immediate disposal. So this would have been a luxury for a queen to pursue, but how much easier would it be just to be a servant? And she ultimately blesses Yahweh, your God, who delights in Solomon and loves Israel forever, and appointed Solomon for the purpose of ruling wisely and prudently and justly. And she gave him a substantial amount of gold, though not 120 talents of gold. We read that his annual income was 666 talents of the same. In the first verse we're going to cover today, we're not quite there yet, but the spices that she gave were above and beyond any other donation. And then we read in the 13th verse, and King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all she desired, whatever she asked, besides what he gave her according to the hand of King Solomon. And she turned and went to her land, she and her servants. There was no question or gift that he could not supply or answer. And whatever she asked for, not only the questions, her most perplexing dilemmas that she could not figure out for herself, she brought it to him, and he gave her what she wanted for it, and he also was generous with his gifts. This was an exchange of gifts. This was a common practice amongst ancient monarchs. This was how alliances were sealed, and Solomon's wisdom compelled him to pursue an alliance-oriented foreign diplomacy, which gave Israel rest from war and enabled them to prosper to the extent that they did. And then she returns thoroughly satisfied and thoroughly impressed, and in that we have a witness, because God is as close as the mention of his name. So if the evil and adulterous generation which walked the earth at the same time that the Savior did not recognize the Messiah in their midst, we have a greater than Solomon above him, and we need to get to know him. 14th verse, lesson itself, 10th chapter, first book of Kings. And the weight of gold that came to Solomon yearly was 666 talents of gold. A talent is a measurement of some 2,000 pounds, and this was Solomon's personal income. It's not, the influx is not what came to Jerusalem, it's what came to Solomon personally. So the science of determining the equivalent amount of money in modern dollars is not an exact one, but it is beyond any reasonable doubt that Solomon's personal net worth was in the equivalent of trillions, and this was possible in the there was no free market capitalism as we know it. The trade and diplomacy were royal monopolies. So, for instance, Augustus Caesar, he controlled 1/5 of the wealth in his entire kingdom. So a substantial percentage of the entire nation's net worth would have been allotted to the king in such a structure of government. Now that number 666 appears most famously in Revelation 13:18. There we read something to the effect of, this is wisdom. This number 666, knowing what it means, is wisdom, and no one knows exactly what it means. Now I have an idea, I have an answer, but not the answer. 6 in the Hebrew numerology is indicative of the earth, the world. 7 is the number of perfection, and there is plenty of numerological significance in the book of Revelation that I touched on in detail I've done every chapter in that book. But in the 13th chapter, we read of the satanic trinity, the two beasts. Now we meet the the dragon, Satan, in the 12th chapter, and in the 13th, which that verse belongs to, we meet his main human minions, the beast who hails from the sea, which is the Antichrist, and then the beast which hails from the earth, which is the mouthpiece. And Satan operates, he doesn't exist in Trinity, but he is an imitator of God. He does not have an original idea to call his own. Everything that he invents is a corrupt counterfeit of the authentic article. So whether it's lust for love, presumption for faith, or anything else, the Satan's version has enough of the properties and characteristics to confuse those who are smitten by its spirit that they have the real thing. So he does not exist in Trinity, but he operates. And why? Because God does. So in the division of labor which exists between the three figures who the 666 represents, Satan is the brains of the operation because we read that his crowns are on his head. The Antichrist is the muscle of the operation because we read that the crowns were on his horns. Horns were equated with strength by the ancient Israelites. And the mouthpiece is the second beast, the false prophet, to be distinct. Now, there's going to be innumerable false prophets, but this is the singular. And there's going to be plenty of false pretender Antichrist, and there are Antichrists in every generation. This is going to be the Antichrist, and they are the minions of Satan. Besides that, from men of travel, and the prophet from traders, and from all the kings of Arabia, and from the governors of the land. So this is additional sources of his income. The travel in the ancient world would have been a lot more difficult. Nevertheless, there was some lucrativity in it. And profit from traders, he engaged in commerce. Now this gold was just one thing that he brought in. He also, there was a barter system among the ancients. So in fact, in the arrangement which existed between himself and King Hiram, the king of the maritime city-side state to the north, Tyre, Israel supplied the food for his palace, and he supplied the expertise. So there was no monetary exchange to speak of. And the kings of Arabia would have been settled by the Ishmaelites, who were the descendant of the son of Abraham through his wife Sarah's Egyptian bondmaiden, Hagar. And what happened is they tried to get ahead of God. They had the promise when Abraham was 86 years old, or actually when he was 75, and it took 25 years to fulfill, but to somewhere near the midway point at the 86 mark, he tried to take matters into his own hand, and they became the father of the Islamic people. But their claim not to be a stickler for semantics, to be an Abrahamic people, is erroneous, because it's not until the 17th chapter that Abram is given the name Abraham. And King Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold. 600 pieces of gold went into each shield. We're talking about 3,000 pounds, which went into these shields of gold. Now, these would have not been battle. These would have been ceremonial. These adorned his palace. Solomon was not a man of war. He was a man of wealth, and he flaunted his wealth with these extravagant shields, which would be confiscated during the 5th year of his son Rehoboam's reign by Shikar, the pharaoh of the 22nd dynasty of Egypt. Now, Solomon had an alliance, a profitable alliance with a nation, which was testament to Israel's growing standing and station in the family of nations. Egypt would have been a force to be reckoned with long before Israel, but the once enslaved people were now on equal terms as arranged by his marriage, but that was from the 21st dynasty, so that the alliance carefully crafted by Solomon would splinter away in his own lifetime. And 300 shields of beaten gold, 3 mina of gold went into each shield, and the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. That is the name of his palace, as indicated in the 7th chapter of this book. And why is it so named? Because Israel did not have the resources of cedar and wood that their neighbor to the north had in abundance. The Phoenicians were famous for 2 things. Their cedar, there was nothing like it. The wood was just adorned the palaces of kings for many, many miles in their circumference. But they also had the best sailors. And so Solomon, the temple was in fact designed. The architect, according to Kings, was a Lebanese man in the employ of Tyre who had an Israelite father. He was a half-breed, but that's where the that's where the architectural ingenuity for the temple that he mostly gets the credit as building actually came from. And the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with refined gold. Why all this extravagance? Well, because he could. He had so much gold that he had enough to do that. He had to have the very best. Everything in his palace was paved with gold. The wine vessels that they drank from were nothing but gold. So too were the shields. So too were the throne. Well, actually, ivory is the tusk of elephants, but it is overlaid. Its exterior is overlaid with refined gold. This would have been thin gold, thin enough to paint and plaster on the expensive ivory material which went under it. So nothing but the very best would do for a man as prestigious as Solomon. The throne had 6 steps, and the top of the throne was round at the back, and there was armrest on either side of the place of the seats, and 2 lions stood besides the armrest. We read some of the physical details, in greater detail, the physical details of the throne itself. It had 6 steps. There's no numerological significance there. We shouldn't read just because we see the numbers 6, 3, 4, and 7 and 12 appear in the Bible doesn't mean that they're automatically connected to the Hebrew numerology that we alluded to earlier. We explained the number 6, that is the number of the world, but it was also a worldly throne. So Solomon's worldliness proved to be his undoing, because eventually by the 11th chapter, well, first off, he's in deviation and violation from some of the royal standards as expressed in the 17th chapter of Deuteronomy. We'll identify where when we get there. But 2 lions are the king of beasts. They have royal splendor and royal dignity. So kings would have, Richard the Lion-hearted. Lions do have a thing that is readily embraced by kings. And he had these besides the armrest of the throne upon which he sat. There was 2 lions surrounding the 6-step throne. And 12 lions were standing there, one on each side of the 6 steps. The likes of it was never made in any reign. Why 12? Well, there were 12 tribes in the nation of Israel. These are the 12 sons of Jacob, the patriarch and father of the Jewish nation. Prior to him, the nation was born through one descendant of Abraham and one descendant of Isaac, and then his 12 sons became the patriarchs of the tribe. And so each tribe was represented. That number 12 was there because he ruled over a kingdom that had 12 tribes in it, and he controlled each one. Judah was the dominant tribe, as declared in Genesis 49:10, the one destined to rule when Israel's nation status and eventual embrace of monarchy was an anticipated eventuality. There is literally nothing like it. No other king had anything to compare or rival with anything like this, so his splendor was exceedingly transcendent. Much as his wisdom was above and beyond the sages, so too was his royal splendor above and beyond the kings in the East, the ancient Near East. And all the drinking vessels of King Solomon's were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of refined gold, not of silver, for this was reckoned of little value in the days of Solomon. So abundant was silver that its value was virtually diminished and obliterated. So much gold, all these, because he had literally everything that there was to have in gold, that meant that silver would not be, there was so much gold that its monetary value would be diminished by the by both the abundance of silver and gold for respective reasons. But the drinking vessels, the plates, everything imaginable, the silverware would have been gold, and nothing but gold would do for a king as prestigious as Solomon. And the house of the forest of Lebanon, once more, is the name of his palace, or the nickname, rather, in refined gold. We read that earlier in the 18th verse. For the king had ships of Tarshish at sea with the fleet of Hiram. Once every 3 years the ship of Tarshish came bringing gold and silver, ivory, and apes, and baboons. Israel was a sea neighboring people, but they were not a maritime people. They were not. That was mostly the expertise and the prerogative was the nation to the north. But during the brief reign of Solomon, they learned from these neighbors and became a force to be reckoned with. They became wealthy of trade by sea and by land. Hiram lent the expertise, and it was made possible by his people and his friendship with his father David, which he perpetuated. He was younger than David and older than Solomon. But this is the triannual income. They bring gold, silver, which was virtually valueless. Its significance depleted and diminished. Ivory, that's what arrayed the throne room, the interior of the throne upon which he sat. Apes and baboons would have been prized possessions of monarchs for their exoticness. It also signalized, their reach in the world, that they could have these things that were unique to distant lands at their court. And King Solomon was greater than any of the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. By measure of wealth and wisdom, there was literally no king like Solomon. This was in fulfillment of a promise given to him in the most biographically significant moment of his life when he's 19 years old. He asked for anything. He's given a blank check, his heart's desire, and what one would ask for in such a situation is a test and a revelation of character. Solomon is wise enough to know that he is not wise enough to do what needs to be done, to build the temple and to rule this great nation that his father had left him flourishing and at rest from its enemies. So because he asked for wisdom, so pleased is God with what he asks for, that he gives him what he did not ask for, wealth beyond measure, and also and prestige and all the things that we're reading of here. But also he gave him longevity of life, but that was conditional. The wealth and the wisdom were unconditional because he had responded to this act of grace and met it the right way. But ultimately, by the 11th chapter, we read that Solomon, or actually by the 10th chapter, and as early as the 3rd chapter, we read that Solomon is deviating from his covenantal obligations. In the 3rd chapter, we read that he offered sacrifices on his own initiative. This was not something that kings were to do, and he did it outside of designated locations. It seems trivial, but from that, sin has a spiraling effect. So from that slight deviation brings us to the excesses of the 11th chapter, which prove his unraveling and his undoing. And all the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. Queen of Sheba was not the only one who sought the wisdom. Anyone who could, anyone who was curious, he was known as the one in whom wisdom exuded. So if you were wise and you lived on the earth, he was the man to see. To hear wisdom, which was not Solomon's own. The secret to Solomon's wisdom was not Solomon, but the God who made him wise, the omniscient one, who put a finite abundance of wisdom in his heart. Solomon was certainly not omniscient. Nevertheless, the provision and endowment of his wisdom was given to him by an omniscient one. He was capable of answering every question that the Queen of Sheba answered, but by the book of Ecclesiastes, which takes place sometime before the 11th chapter, we find him questioning of 1 Kings, having questions which he cannot answer. And they were each bringing his present objects of silver and objects of gold, and garments and armor, and spices, horses and mules, a rate year by year. These people who came to seek out his wisdom did not come empty-handed. So this wisdom did attract wealth and travel to his kingdom. Israel was being a witness to the world, a witness of Yahweh to the nations. So these people came to hear the wisdom of Yahweh through Solomon and have a positive testimony of the God of Israel. But they brought all these gifts, and this was just something you would do if you were a guest. You would not show up empty-handed with nothing if you were to visit, such a king at such a court. One could not gain access without gifts such as these. But we read horses, of which we're going to read in greater detail in the next verse, 26th verse. And Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen, and he had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. Solomon's reign was peace. This is derivative of his name. Now, names in our culture are almost arbitrarily assigned according to the whim or fancy of the parent, but names in the Bible always mean something, and Solomon's name means peace. It can also be translated as a replacement. Remember, he is the second son of, but oldest surviving one, of David and Bathsheba. They had an older brother who died 8 days when he was 8 days old. But where was I? Oh yeah, the chariots and his rule was peace through strength. So he was not so pacifistic as to not rely on military might. The peace was only possible because he had all these things. Nevertheless, this was one of the things that Yahweh warned the nation of Israel through his prophet Moses and also Samuel of the excesses of kings. So it was not necessary that he has all these things, and it was in fact a sin to deviate from the standards that were warned about in the 17th chapter of Deuteronomy. See especially verses 16 or 17 but he had entire cities devoted to the housing and stationing of this cavalry. And the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and he made cedars as plenty as the sycamores, which are in the low country. Silver, we already have read, was virtually valueless in the kingdom of Solomon because it was so common. It was as common as stones. Stones are, of course, far more common than silver, so this is some hyperbole. Every road is paved with stone, but he didn't have literal roads of silver and gold, which await us in the New Jerusalem. Also, cedars are so plentiful as sycamore trees. This would have been the common tree in the low country of Israel. That reference would have been more readily recognized by its ancient audience than ourselves, but the cedar came from the nation to the north. The cedars were indigenous to the land of Lebanon, what came to be called Lebanon, but was known as Phoenicia in the ancient times. And Solomon had horses brought out from Egypt and Q. The king's merchants brought them from Q at a price. He had a lucrative position as the middleman of the trade in chariots, and in the warning of Deuteronomy, they are instructed not to look to Egypt for horses, because this was a reminder and a repudiation of their deliverance from that nation. Nevertheless, Solomon did extract an advantageous alliance from that nation, but this deviation has the spiraling effect of sin, which ultimately culminates into his unraveling and undoing in the 11th chapter. Though immortalized in a heroic lens, Solomon is ultimately a tragic figure, because that's so great a man could fall is a warning to us all. And a chariot came up and went out from Egypt for 600 pieces of silver, and a horse 150. And so by the hand they brought them out to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Aram. The land of the Hittites would have been in Asia Minor, the modern country of Turkey. They were one of the 7 nations that inhabited the land of Canaan when the Israels dispossessed. And Aram would have been the neighboring nation to the north of the neighboring nation to the north. Phoenicia, it would have been Syria. That was the ancient name of Syria. So these were the partners and the people affected and involved by this international commerce, this trade in horses. And 600 pieces of silver would have been a hefty sum, even though silver was accounted as virtually worthless by the reign of Solomon. So plentiful did the gold overflow. And this splendor, the road to excess is the road to ruin, because all this worldliness was unnecessary, and eventually the extravagant palace life leads to an excess of indulgence and concubines and wives who turn away his heart and succumb to idolatry, ultimately culminating in the permanent splinter of the United Nation of Israel, though not in his own lifetime. But it did not take long for his foolish son and successor to fritter away everything that Solomon had labored. Remember, he's the one that Shishak, the founder of the 22nd dynasty of Israel, confiscated the gold shields of Solomon in his reign. So he was off to a disastrous start even before then. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.